Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we examine the geopolitical consequences of the global pandemic. For most people, the spread of coronavirus has been a matter of avoiding the contagion and keeping your job. However, anthropologist Wade Davies caused new sensation this month by penning a political article in Rolling Stone, which has gone viral. He forecast that the one result of COVID-19 could be to foreshadow an epoch-making moment, the end of the American era.
When I say that America is at the end of an American era, look, I mean, I don't wish that. We'll be nostalgic, as I say, for the American century and the best parts of it. But remember that all empires are born to die.
All this coming up in the programme, but first to Alex with your tweets, messages and emails.
Now we're going to spend a bit longer on your messages this week because last week's show, featuring Professor Hugh Montgomery, the intensive care expert, and Dr. Chris Smith, the Cambridge virologist, provoked an extraordinarily large response, and the quality of the contributions was excellent. Many of you found the show both disturbing but very, very informative. Janet, for example, says, the two experts Alec interviewed are frontline scientists working with the virus at the moment. Good to know there's a lot of sharing of information going on around the world. And Cecile says, definitely one of the best discourses on the COVID-19 pandemic. There are many variables, and we will succeed together or fail together. We are our brother's keepers. Roger says, very informative. The virus attacks everything, not only the lungs. There's no place for complacency. And a hugely interesting tweet from Neil Cameron. Having had the virus in April and still have the lasting effects from it, I found the information really interesting but also worrying, considering they don't know what the long term holds for those who have had the disease, especially where it was said that the body is attacking its own healthy cells. The big problem is very few who've had COVID have had the opportunity to see a doctor regarding their ongoing symptoms. And Richard and Kate say, we are writing to say how much we enjoyed and appreciated your item on COVID. You let them speak and did not interrupt them or try to score political points. And Sky Echo says, little bit scary, but personally I prefer to know what we're dealing with. Andrew Norfolk said, tuned into the Alex Salmond Show for the first time. Well, welcome aboard, Andrew. Incredibly informative and helpful. Tasmina, a superb and glamorous host. Miss her from the House of Commons. GH1 says, one of the best, most informative discussions on COVID that I have seen. Hugely interesting. Two top UK experts. If you missed it, look for the rerun. Highly recommended. Margaret says, wow, a must watch. Thanks for this. Hope it deals with some of the complacency that seems to be spreading. Now, Mary Haggerty takes an opposite point of view to many of our contributors. So this virus kills the vast majority of people? I thought the vast majority survive it very well. And the killer which will pale COVID-19 into the ranks of generally non-fatal diseases will be worldwide unemployment and destitution, killing millions upon millions and millions more than COVID-19 ever will. Where are the voices of sanity, Mary asks, or do they not fit this disgraceful and very disturbing narrative? And finally, Mary, on a sad but in some ways a hopeful note, she says, having lost two friends to COVID, I don't really want to experience it. One will seem to get back on its feet after 3 years of Spanish flu. I'm sure we can overcome this too. So back to Tasmina.
Last week, the 2020 Democratic National Convention met in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and virtually across the country. Among the notable speakers rallying to the cause were former Presidents Carter, Clinton and Obama, and former First Lady Michelle Obama. The Democrats were also able to field George W. Bush's Secretary of State, Colin Powell. The star-spangled cast was assembled virtually to acclaim former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris of California as the party's nominees for President and Vice President. This week, in contrast, the Republicans have also met virtually, but with a difference. Some convention proceedings, albeit reduced in scale, were still held in the original pre-COVID venue, Charlotte, North Carolina. But events and festivities, including today's keynote speech from the President himself, are featured remotely from various locations. Of the 5 top featured speakers, 4 carried the surname Trump. The Democrats are ahead, but the polls show signs of tightening. Both sides agree there is all to play for in the election. But is there? Is there an argument that whether it's a Biden first term or a Trump second term, America's days as a dominant world power are drawing to a close? In today's show, Alex interviews the world-leading anthropologist Wade Davies. He believes that the Trump presidency and the inability to handle COVID-19 are but symptoms of the fall of the American century.
I'm now delighted to be joined from his home in Vancouver by Wade Davies. Wade, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks, Alex, for having me.
Now, Professor of Anthropology in British Columbia, a winner of multi-awards for exploration, for photography, author of many books, but few have caused as much stir as this remarkable and very political article in the Rolling Stone arguing the end of America. That's a pretty dramatic statement, Wade.
Well, it's not really, I think of it less as political than a love letter to a country that I really adore. I was born a Canadian, but I married an American. I became an American. My kids were raised in the States. I found my career in the States. And the interesting thing is this article was really just trying to look at COVID through the cultural lens. It's really a cultural story, not a medical story. And the question that looms in everybody's mind is, why did New Zealand do so well? Why has Canada done so well? And what went wrong south of our border? And so it's not really a political story per se, but it does suggest that the countries that did well were those that have a strong social contract, that have national health care, hospitals that cater to the collective, not the individual, and certainly not the private investor who views every hospital bed as a rental property. And it kind of reflected on the fact that epidemics often become fulcrums of history. The Black Death that transformed medieval Europe and basically broke the back of the medieval age. Some epidemics have less impact. The Spanish flu killed millions of people, but in a world that was so used to death because of the Great War that it almost went unpassed. My own grandfather, Alex, walked out in Calgary one morning in 1919 on his way to work, and he was dead by the afternoon. But the Spanish flu didn't shake us in that way, I think because we are used to death. Yet this COVID is different, and it's coming at a point where people are asking what's become of America.
Well, few would argue that America and President Trump in particular has handled the crisis well, but I mean, other countries have also struggled. The impeccable social democratic credentials of Sweden, for example, have a higher death rate per million than America. The United Kingdom has a higher death rate per million. So yes, there are countries which have done spectacularly better. There's also social democratic countries which have done worse.
Those are kind of anomalies if you think about it. I mean, Sweden made a very specific choice, didn't it, to basically ignore the virus and hope that it would basically be absorbed by the populace and turn out to be benign. That turned out not to be the case. And in the case of Britain, you, like America, were led by an individual who was a populist who basically denied for a long and critical period the virulence of this disease. Look, Canada's no perfect place. When rates of death and morbidity in the States were soaring, we in British Columbia, in all of our hospitals, had 5 cases of COVID. So what was the difference? That's part of what this article tries to ask.
I think the most generous thing you say about the Donald is that he is the product of dissent as opposed to the cause of it. So there's something a bit deeper going on than this American president.
When I say that America is at the end of an American era, look, I mean, I don't wish that. We'll be nostalgic, as I say, for the American century and the best parts of it. But remember that all empires are born to die. As a journalist at the Irish Times said so poignantly, people have had many feelings about America over the years, but they've never, ever, ever felt pity for the United States. And as health workers desperately awaited relief flights of basic supplies from China, I argue that the hinge of history moved to the Asian century.
Yeah, and you cite the exchange between an American official and a Chinese official in the Foreign Ministry, where he answered to protestations about the situation in Hong Kong with the words, "Let me breathe." Isn't the surrender of moral authority a problem?
It's so clever you mentioned that, Alex, because I mean, the tragedy of it, of course, is that as America suddenly started to act like a tin pot dictator, I mean, imagine you have this is a country that's, was a pioneer in all great medical breakthroughs, defeating polio, defeating smallpox, leading the world in medical technology, certainly in the 20th century. And suddenly you have a buffoon of a president at a point of incredibly desperate national need, where there is an American dying every minute of every day, standing at the podium and recommending the use of a household cleansing disinfectant as a treatment of a disease that he didn't have the intellectual capacity even to understand. And so the real tin pot dictators of the world suddenly had a chance to take the high road. And the culmination of that is when America tried to make comments about both the mishandling of the epidemic in China at the initial outbreak, but also its crushing of democracy in Hong Kong, when the American Foreign Secretary, the Secretary of State, was trying to sort of make a comment about that, the Chinese ministry simply had to take a breath and say, I can't breathe, invoking the treatment of the unfortunate Floyd who died in Minneapolis, So I think there's just these signs of an America that is so deeply polarized, and one of the extraordinary consequences of the Trump era, and I don't think there's anyone clever enough in that White House to have actually done this deliberately, but the way that truth has become malleable, the way that truth has become relativistic, the way that truth is what you say it to be, to the extent where literally his core followers will deny reality if that serves his interest. And that's a kind of stunning inversion. If you really want to know one sure sign of what I would define as a terminal decadence of the United States, it's that moment. When a nation doesn't recognize the truth, it means it has no collective sense of itself, no benign sense of its own internal well-being. And when I speak of the countries that got on top of this, they are the social democracies. And as always said, social democracy will never work in America. It's socialism or communism light. Well, social democracy may never work in America, but if true, it's a stunning indictment, and it's a perfect indication of what Oscar Wilde had in mind when he said the United States was the only country to go from barbarism to decadence without passing through civilization.
And finally, on this section, is there a hopeful scenario? I mean, can America be led back to the shining city on the hill? And is Joe Biden the person to lead them there?
I'm the first to say my life was made in the United States, a kind of eclectic, entrepreneurial, risk-taking career that I followed to become an independent scholar could never have happened in my home country in Canada in 1,000 years. So, I revere that wildness and the madness of the United States. And so with any kind of hope, it will steer its way back, because we need that vision of what the America that we all love represents. But as long as the country is being torn asunder by those who are deliberately doing that for their own personal needs, my father-in-law was almost president of the United States. He turned down the vice presidency when Nixon offered it to him because he later served on the committee that brought Nixon down. My brother-in-law was a Democratic senator for 18 years. I mean, I love the United States. I love what it can represent, but right now, I'm not sure that the depths of polarization will ever pull it back together. And unless someone can come along, and much as I think Biden is a nice man, he's not the figure of history that he's going to be at best a caretaker. And the reason to vote Democrat in November is not because of the values of the Democratic Party. I'm a complete independent. The absolute crisis of American democracy is not simply defeating Trump, but defeating resoundingly what he represents. And if the election is close, or heaven forbid he is reelected, then I think the road into the future looks very grim indeed for the United States.
Join me after the break, where I'll be talking with Wade Davis about the range of his work, and in particular his love affair with the South American country of Colombia.
Welcome back. Alex is in conversation with the Canadian anthropologist Wade Davis. They move on to discuss his latest book, Magdalena, the great river of his favourite country, Colombia.
Magdalena is a remarkable new book. I mean, I can't imagine there's any Colombian isn't best pleased that you've contributed this masterpiece. And why did you fall in love with this country?
You know, when I was a little boy, my mother, who was a very humble but determined Canadian woman, told me in 1968 that Spanish was the language of the future. And she worked all year as a secretary in a local public school to earn enough money to allow me to join a group of schoolboys that a British professor was going to take to Colombia. And at the time when most Canadians had never been in a commercial airplane, the South American destination was terribly exotic. And I was the youngest of the group at 14, and many of the older lads at 16 suffered from what the Colombians call mamitis, which is homesickness. And I, by contrast, found that I felt like I had finally found home. There was just something about the energy of the people, the warmth, the understanding of the frailty of the human spirit. And then I just was enchanted the entire time. And then I went back with a one-way ticket when I was 20 years old and became an acolyte of the great botanical explorer Richard Evans Schultes, and spent 2 years in Colombia as a botanist and an anthropologist, living amongst indigenous people and studying the flora of the neotropical rainforest. And Magdalena is, in a way, Hector Abad, who's a great Colombian writer who wrote a book called Oblivion, and his father was one of the deaths in Colombia during these horrible years that really shook the nation, was the death of Hector's father. And Hector is famously bitter about that, and it's well known. And so when he writes in the back cover of Magdalena, you know, only Wade could make me love my country again. He describes the book as a love letter to the country. And just before, you know, we met today, 2 days ago, I got a call from Juan Manuel Santos, the ex-president, Nobel laureate for peace. And he had read the book. I sent it to him, and he's a friend of mine. And he said, every Colombian must read this book. And in a way, the book holds a mirror. You know, in a certain same way, the previous segment we were speaking about how that Rolling Stone piece, my attempt was to really hold a mirror to the Americans to sort of show what had become of them. In the case of Magdalena, I'm trying to hold a mirror to the Colombians to show all that's good about their nation, you know. And one of the reasons the peace process struggles is because of a kind of a latent, lingering pessimism and negativity that is inevitable in a people that have suffered through 50 years of war. And the reason I picked the River Magdalena is it's the Mississippi of Colombia. It is both the corridor of commerce and the fountain of culture, the source of poetry and literature, music and prayer. And a big point of the book is to point out to particularly North American audiences that, you know, yes, Colombia has suffered from 50 years of war, but that war would not have lasted a day if it was not for the profits of the drug trade. I mean, the fuel of the fire of violence and war that has killed 220,000 Colombians and left 7 million homeless and forced 5 million to flee their country was always cocaine. And so all of us who live in societies who have both facilitated the black market by making the drug illegal and yet doing nothing to really limit the trade, even as we consume the drug in boardrooms and bars across Europe and North America, all of us owe something to Colombia.
Now, President Santos, of course, made you a Colombian citizen. Do you think the peace that he established, for which he won the Nobel Award, can that peace hold? Is it a very shaky and difficult time still?
Will the peace endure? Colombia will never go back to the chaos of previous years. It's a little bit like Ireland. Why did peace come to Ireland? The people just said enough. And generally these wars of civil strife come to an end when all sides are kind of collectively exhausted. So in that sense, peace will endure. Colombia is safe to travel in. It's extraordinary. It's become kind of the hippest tourist destination in the world right now. And yet peace is precarious, in part because in the wake of the peace agreement, those opposed to it elected President Duque, who, despite the fact that homicide rates in the first year of peace after the agreement in Havana and Cartagena in 2016, homicide rates dropped to levels not seen since 1975. And yet still there was this attempt to reform the agreement that led to disappointment on the part of those who had signed the agreement. So all of this is in balance. But and of course, Uribe has just been put under house arrest. So there's some instability. But I have great confidence, as the book makes clear, that fundamentally, as the world seems to be falling apart, Colombia is falling together.
Now, I'm a devotee of great first lines, and in the book proper, I was particularly impressed with the mouth of the Rio Magdalena is the colour of the earth. Give us just a sign of what makes you love this topography and this people so much.
Well, first of all, you know, Colombia is without doubt the most diverse, both geographically, ecologically, botanically, biologically, a diverse country in the world. There is no place in Colombia more than a day removed from every known ecosystem on the planet. There are more bird species in Colombia than any other nation. It is a stunningly beautiful landscape. And what really drives the wonder of Colombia is the spirit of the people themselves, which is simply hard to explain. You know, people talk about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, as the creator of what is often called magical realism in the literature of Latin America. But people forget that Gabo was a journalist. He was an observer all his life. He just happened to live in a land where heaven and earth converge on a regular basis to reveal glimpses of the divine. You know, when I was a young man coming of age in Colombia in the early 70s, living where my hat fell, on the open road, I never once was afraid. My entire journey was enveloped with a kind of cloak of wonder and the kindness of Colombian people. I mean, another way of thinking about it, and you, as a government official, at one point in your career, you'd understand this. I mean, think of this. You know, all of that three-way civil war, there were never more than 200,000 combatants in a country of 52 million people. The vast majority of Colombians were innocent victims of a three-way war fueled exclusively by cocaine. Think of it. At the height of the Medellin cartel, the amount of money coming into Colombia was such that the cartel budgeted $1,000 US a week just to buy elastic bands to wrap the money in. Think about that. And yet, for all the challenges, through all those years, Colombia maintained civil society and democracy, greened its cities, created millions of acres of national parks, sought restitution with indigenous people, and critically has paved the way for an economic renaissance as thousands of kids forced to flee the conflict are returning home from every capital of Europe, every major city in North America, with skill sets in every conceivable endeavor. And so if I were to bet economically on the future of a nation in the Americas, I would put my wagers on Colombia.
And my final question to you, Wade Davis, is the big one. I mean, forget for a second if the American century is giving way to the Chinese century. Who's up, who's down, who's roundabout? Is humankind as a whole still making progress? Or is that essential aspect of progress, which we have grown up with as an assumption, is that now in question?
I tend to remain completely optimistic, A, because I'm a father, and because I also believe that pessimism is an indulgence. I think despair is an insult to the imagination. I think orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. I think, you know, what I learned from my father, Alex, which he learned from his father, is that there's good and evil in the world. And my dad used to say to me, don't expect to win, but pick your side and get on with it. And I like that in a sort of Buddhist sense. You know, the goal is not a destination. The goal isn't to win. The goal is a state of mind and a path. And, you know, one of the reasons I think people burn out in old age or become embittered is that they always expect to win something and then they lose and they get embittered. An environmental battle or a literal battle. And if you realize that it's all a process of life, it allows you to win some and lose some, but keep pushing the wheel of what my father would say, justice and righteousness forward. And if you do that, you can go to your death knowing that at least you were the architect of your own life and you did your bit for all that is good in the spirit of humanity.
Wade Davis, anthropologist, writer of remarkable books and articles. Thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks, Alex, so much for having me. God bless.
The gaze of Wade Davies roams far and wide, from the rivers of Colombia to the mountains of Nepal. However, few works in his glittering career have had more impact than his recent Rolling Stone article on the decline and fall of America. Perhaps both the Democrat and Republican conventions should have started with a 3-minute silence to mourn the passing of dominance of their nation. Of course, the American empire will inevitably fall, just as so many others have before. And it is true that COVID-19 has demonstrated one of America's key weaknesses: the total inability to subordinate individual freedom for the collective good, even when the case for doing so is overwhelming. But all is not yet lost for America. One of its characteristics over the last 246 years or so has been resilience. It was, after all, as Wade Davis puts it, American industrial might and Russian blood which saved the world from darkness in World War II. Although still supreme in technology and commercial power, America may no longer be totally dominant. However, neither is she finished. And so from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.